Go.
Okay, before we start today, we're going to talk about what you should be able to do by the end of this lesson. So today we are going to talk about converting fractions to decimals. So you should be able to take a fraction and turn it into a decimal. And then you should also be able to identify if the decimal is terminating or repeating. So we're going to go over those steps together. And remember, it's your job to stop as we go and write down your notes, because you may not go through and write as quickly as I do. So remember to pause, take your time and write out your notes, and continue as needed. Okay? So our title today is going to be Turning Fractions into Decimals. And then down below, we're just going to add repeating and terminating, because that's the type of decimals we're going to talk about. Repeating and terminating. Now, some of these are big words and you haven't heard them before in math, so we're going to go through and we will talk about those when we come to decimals. But for now, we're just going to go through the steps of how to turn the fraction into a decimal before we talk about the types. Okay? So for our purposes in 7th grade math, all fractions are going to be turned into decimals. If you see a fraction, you're going to convert it to a decimal. So we're just going to write that down. Nice little mark, okay? Fractions must be turned into decimals. Okay, very important. Fractions must be turned into decimals. There we go. Sorry, it was a little blurry. Okay? In order to do that, we need to go through some steps. So let's say that we have a fraction of 6/8. So I'm going to write my fraction, 6/8. And remember, fractions are just division. Very important to know, it's just division. Okay? So, the first thing that we are going to do, step number 1, is you take the top number, as my pen runs out, sorry guys, take the top number of your fraction. It's also called the numerator, the top number. So this one right here would be the 6. And you're going to enter it into the calculator. Now remember, if you need to stop and pause and write this down, and then go through the steps with me. So I'm going to take my 6, okay, and I'm going to enter the 6 into the calculator. My next step, side here, the next step is to hit the division sign, or lightly tap the division sign. You don't have to be aggressive. Remember, the division sign is the one that looks like a fraction. It has the dot above and the dot below like you would have your numbers. So I'm going to hit the division sign. I still have the 6 on there, right here, underneath the clear button. Divided by, okay? the next step in our process is to enter the bottom number. The bottom number is called the denominator. So if I say the denominator, you should know it's the bottom. The numerator is on top, the denominator is on the bottom. Okay, so I'm gonna enter that 8 in the calculator now. In between here, I hit that division sign. Okay, so I have 6 divided by, and I'm gonna press 8. So now I have 8 on my screen. My fourth step is to press the equal sign. Okay, I'm gonna press equals. I wanna know, what does this equal? And now I have my decimal, okay? So, my final step, this is very important because you don't wanna mix up your numbers or mess this up. Your final step, always do this. It's just a good practice, best practice really as you go into 8th grade too, when you're ordering numbers later in the school year. This is really gonna help you if you always do this, okay? Write your decimal next to the fraction. Okay, so you're gonna write the decimal next to the fraction. So I had 6/8 up here, and I plugged it in, and it gave me 0.75. You see the little decimal right there. So I'm gonna write 0.75. Now, however I need to use that fraction, I'm gonna use 0.75 instead of trying to use 6/8. So that's converting your fraction into a decimal. Now, we have 2 different types of decimals that we're gonna talk about, and those are repeating and terminating. A terminating decimal it ends, it terminates. Some of you have seen the movie The Terminator. The Terminator ends people. A terminating decimal has a definitive or a very set ending. You see where the number ends. Like 0.75, it ends at that 5. There's nothing extra behind it. You see that it ends, there's no more numbers. Okay, so a terminating decimal, it ends. So an example of that, I'm gonna come in here and clear that fraction. I wanna do the fraction 78 over 100. And remember, you guys need to stop, pause your notes, and write down things to catch up. Go at your own pace. So I'm gonna enter my number. Remember, the first thing you do is the numerator, the top number, 78. My second step is to hit the division button, divided by. My third step is to enter the denominator, or the bottom number, 100. And my fourth step is to hit enter, so it calculates, okay? This number has a definitive end. That means it stops. It doesn't keep going. There's nothing extra. So it turned into 0.78. The last step that I had was to write my new decimal next to my fraction. So I'm gonna write the 0.78. It's terminating because it ends. Okay? The second type is a repeating decimal. And I know you guys are going to be so surprised that a repeating decimal repeats. It has a pattern and it goes on forever. You can predict what's going to come next. Okay? So this one has a pattern. And goes on and on forever. Now in your calculator, it'll just stop and round up at the very end, but if your screen is filled with numbers, you'll see what I mean. So we're going to do an example here so you guys can really see what I'm talking about. So I'm going to use 1/6 as my fraction. And I'm going to turn that into my decimal. So I'm going to clear it out. I'm going to enter my numerator. Move this up here so you can see it a little better. So I'm going to enter my 1. I'm going to divide. I'm going to enter the denominator or bottom number, 6. And I'm going to press enter. And so you see the screen is filled up with these 6's. This 6 will go on forever. That is a repeating decimal. The way that we write that is I have the 0, I have a 1, the 1 doesn't repeat. The only number that repeats here is the 6. So you write your 6. If you want, you can draw 2 6's, it's fine. And then you draw a line over the top of the 6. Whatever you draw your line over the top of, that's the number that repeats again and again and again. So that's how you write a repeating decimal. Okay. Now we have a couple more things to talk about, and they're more rules that you just have to know. It's not things that you have to do. So it shouldn't be extremely difficult. So one of the rules that we're going to talk about is when you have a mixed number. Okay? So this is important. If a number has a fraction with it, that's what we call a mixed number. So it has a whole number followed by a fraction. And I'll write down an example so you see what I'm talking about. Okay? So an example of that would be, I'm just going to write one to the side. 5 1/5. That's what I'm talking about, a mixed number right here. It has a whole number and a fraction. Okay. When it has that, you always leave the whole number alone. Okay, so I'm leaving this 5 alone. I'm not touching it. The only thing that I'm going to do is turn this fraction, the 1/5, into a decimal and then put it at the end of the 5. Okay. So I'm just going to write what I told you. You turn the fraction into a decimal. And add it whole number. Or just write it behind the whole number. So our example here. I said we have 5 1/5. I am not touching that 5. That 5 is a whole number. I'm leaving it alone. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and rewrite it down here so it is ready. And then I'm going to put my decimal right there. Because I know that it is 5 and some part, something. And now I'm going to go back through my steps to turn that fraction into a decimal. So I have 1/5, so I'm just going to do 1 divided by 5 equals, and it's 0.2. So all I do is add in my 0.2. Now you can use that. It's all set up for you to use. The last rule, and I'm just going to try to squeeze it on here, because it doesn't take a lot. If your number begins with a negative sign, you leave the negative sign alone. Don't mess with it, just leave it in front of the number. Okay? So if the number begins with a negative, what do? You leave it alone. You keep the negative sign. And you'll move it down whenever you convert your fraction. You'll just move it down to in front of the decimal. So you just leave it alone. Doesn't want you bothering it. It's very negative, doesn't have anything positive to say. So if my example was a negative 5 1/5, I would just add it down here to my new number. That's all you have to do. You just leave it alone. So that is the end of our notes today on turning fractions into decimals and talking about the two types of decimals, which are terminating, they end, terminating ends, and repeating. They go on forever. And remember, that line just indicates what it is that repeats again and again and again and again, forever and ever and ever and ever. And that's the end of our lesson.